Hello everybody, today I will show you how to rebuild a VW 3 boxer engine. So first of all, what we are going to do is the following thing. We are going to remove the gear assembly from our old crankshaft in order to clean them and install them with a new crankshaft with a new bearing. For this I'm going to use these pliers in order to remove the securing clip or ring. And then I'm going to use this Chinese bearing extractor, which costs around 30 bucks, but it works great for removing the gears. Of course, you can also get the factory tools, but they're expensive and you can do the exact same job with way cheaper tools. So if you want my opinion, get a bearing extractor for this job. So afterwards we're going to clean our crankshaft and all the oil passages, and we're going to put some assembly lube into the bearing surfaces. This assembly lube will eliminate any dry stars. After this we are going to install the bearing. Note the correct orientation. For that you are going to test fit the bearings and then install an arrow which shows towards the flywheel so you know how to install it. I will show you how to do it afterwards. And then you will install this clip. Afterwards you will install your heated gears. You will heat them to 93 degrees Celsius. Then you're going to install your spacer, and then you're going to install the distributor drive gear. Afterwards you will get a new securing ring and you will install it with these pliers. It's also very crucial to check that the securing ring has been seated properly. So afterwards what we are going to do is we are going to clean the connecting rods. What I did is I cleaned them thoroughly, and then I also took a lighter to burn any lint from my lint-free tires off, and then I used compressed air to clean the caps. And after this you can install your bearings. After installing the bearings, we will assemble the connecting rod and we will weight it. What we have to do is the following. We have to create 2 sets of connecting rods, one for the first and the third cylinder, and the other for the second and the fourth cylinder. These sets have to have approximately the same weight. This is going to reduce the vibration of the engine. So afterwards, what we are going to do is we're going to take our marker, and with this marker we are going to note the position of the connecting rod and its weight, of course. So after doing this, we are going to create our sets, which will have approximately the equal weight. We have a 10-gram tolerance. So afterwards what we are going to do is we are going to install our connecting rods. For this I'm going to use assembly lube on the bearings. You have to note the position of the connecting rods while installing them on the crankshaft. So the crankshaft has to be aligned like that, and these markings around the cycles need to face towards you. This procedure is also explained very well on the manual, which you have to get in order to rebuild your engine properly. What's also very important is that the numbers on the bearing and the connecting rods align in order to avoid any issues afterwards. So what's also very important is that if you have the connecting rods with stretch rods, you have to replace them and then get them honed in order to make them round again. In this case, it's not really worth it, so I would suggest just buying a new set of connecting rods as they aren't that expensive. Afterwards, we are going to oil the surface of the nuts of the connecting rods, which touches the connecting rod, but we are not going to oil the threads. This is going to allow us to torque the nuts properly. Then I'm going to take a ratchet and just make the nuts hand tight. And afterwards I'm going to tap the connecting rod with a hammer, and then I'm going to repeat this procedure until I see that I can't tighten the nut anymore with the same amount of force. Of course, hand tight. You're not going to torque it down with a ratchet. You will use a torque wrench, and then you will repeat the same procedure. So what this does is it eliminates any tensions of the bearings, and it allows you to torque the bearings properly. So afterwards you have, of course, to spin the connecting rod around, and if you see that it's binding, you need to disassemble it and see why it's binding. So if you have the stretch bolts, you also need to use a torque angle, and after that you are pretty much ready to install the crankshaft in the engine case. So afterwards we're going to install the bearing number 4. Also you need to note the position of it. Of course we are going to use assembly loop again. Then we will install the washer and the key. After installing those, the crankshaft is ready to be installed into the crankcase. What I also need to note is that you need to clean your case thoroughly, and then you can use this cleaner in order to remove the old factory sealant of the case. Please don't use Scotch-Brite or any sandpaper, as this destroys the sealing surfaces, which may create oil leaks and other issues. So here I also show you how I installed or pre-installed the bearings in order to note their position. And now I'm installing the half bearing into the crankcase. Afterwards, we can put the crankshaft into the crankcase. What's also very important to note is that all the bearings have been seated properly. In order to check that, you're going to take the half bearing and put it in the middle just put it over the second bearing journal or main bearing journal, and you don't want to see any gap. If you see a gap, it means that the bearings haven't been aligned properly, and you need to realign them, of course, or you're going to destroy your bearings. And if you don't notice that after the assembly, and if you try to run the engine, you will have a catastrophic engine failure. So afterwards, we are going to install the bearings of the camshaft. You need to check that they are moving freely, especially the thrust bearing and the camshaft, because sometimes, because they're aftermarket, they won't fit properly. And then you have to remove some material by sanding them down, or you just get another set and try if it's better. And I also need to note that on the newer sets you need to file the one tank down, because they don't offer the correct sets anymore. Afterwards, I'm going to use some assembly lube, as I'm doing on all the bearings. So now I'm going to install the camshaft, and what's very important to know is that the dots of it have to be aligned with the dots on the crankshaft. So here you see the number. So if your previous crankshaft has too much play, you get a smaller number, a bigger number, and if your previous camshaft has, or your camshaft now has too little play or no play at all, then you need to get a camshaft with a smaller number. With no play at all, I mean that if you rotate the crankshaft and if it lifts up the camshaft, it's too tight and you need to change the gear. If you don't do that, you will ruin your bearings. So afterwards, we will check the end play, which is within the tolerances. Now I'm going to put some assembly lube into the camshaft gears. As you see now, I'm just rotating it in both directions in order to check that everything is fine. But of course, if you have play, you don't really need to do that, as it means that it has enough play and it won't get damaged. But you still can do it just for peace of mind. Afterwards, I will obviously also install some assembly lube into the camshaft, bearings which touch the hydraulic lifters. And then I'm going to cool down or heat up the room to 23 degrees Celsius in order to allow the sealant to work properly. I also need to note that I didn't rotate the crankshaft in both directions in the video, but I actually did without filming it, of course. It's just a small note which I need to add. Here I'm using anaerobic sealant. This anaerobic sealant has a following property. It does mix with oil if it doesn't harden, which means that it hardens on the part you clamp the case down, but if you have any excess which squeezes into the engine, it won't plug up any oil galleries or so. It will just dissolve into the oil and then it will come out with the next oil change. This is also what the factory used. So now I'm going to install the other case half, and I'm going to tap it with my hand, and I also use a hammer and I just slightly tap it on the side in order to make the bearing seat into the case. What's also very important is that when you do this, and also when you torque down your case, you need to see if the crankshaft is turning properly. If it doesn't, or if it's binding, don't continue with assembly. Disassemble everything and then check why it happened. It probably happened because the bearings weren't aligned properly. Now what I do is I take my nuts and I install the same sealant I installed for the case halves, and then I thread them on, of course. Just finger tight for the beginning, and then I will torque them down with the correct sequence, which I will show you, to the correct torque spec, via torque wrench, of course. What I also did is I cleaned the surfaces of the nuts and the washers with a special cleaner from Loctite, but you can also use another degreaser, stuff like that, in order to allow the sealant to work properly. Engine building involves a lot of cleaning, which I obviously didn't film because I don't think that somebody would like to watch a video of a guy cleaning his engine case for 3 hours or so. So now what we are going to do is we are going to torque this M8 nut down, the one over the camshaft cap. This has to be the first nut you are going to torque down. If you don't do this, you will probably end up with some engine issues. And then afterwards we are going to torque down all the bigger nuts, and 10 nuts. And after these have been torqued down, we will torque down the rest of the M8 nuts. Here you can also see the sequence. I'm torquing all this down. Now, as I said, it's also very important to check that the crankshaft rotates easily while torquing the engine case down. If it doesn't, disassemble everything and check why it binds. So now we are going to check the end play. So for that I did the following thing. I installed the flywheel and I checked the play. Then I subtracted the play you want to have at the end. And then I took the number I had, which then results in the thickness of the shims I have to use. This works out pretty good, to be honest, so I would suggest you to do this also. But of course, you can also just put some 3 shims in it. You are only allowed to use 3. And then you can play around with it until you get the correct end play. What counts at the end is that you get the correct end play, and the rest doesn't really matter, to be honest. What I also need to note is that the flywheel bolts are one-time use. They are torque to yield, as I said, which means that you can't reuse them, of course. We are going to use new flywheel bolts, which will be installed with some thread locker, and then they will be torqued down with our torque wrench. So now you see the end play, which is within the factory tolerance. And now we're going to install the pilot bearing. What is very important is that the letters face towards the outside. Don't ask me why, it just has to be like that. I also need to know that it will help if you put the bearing into the freezer for a few hours. So afterwards we will install the correct grease into this bearing, and then we can proceed with preparing the rear main seal in order to install the flywheel. Of course, we will start by the shims. We will oil them so that there isn't any extra friction, and after doing this we can install our rear main seal. The rear main seal has to be bottomed out. If you install it flush, it will rub against the flywheel, which will cause a rear main seal failure. So after that, we are going to prepare our flywheel. In order to do that, we are going to get a new felt seal. It doesn't have to be new, but I would suggest you to get a new one just in case. And we are going to soak it in oil. This will allow it to seal properly. Afterwards, we will take our O-ring, and we will put it into the flywheel groove. Don't reuse any of the seals or you're going to have major issues. Now we will oil the crankshaft up and the rear main seal touches the flywheel. If you have a PTFE seal, you don't want to oil this area though, because it will result in a rear main seal failure. So afterwards we will install our flywheel bolts. These flywheel bolts will need some thread locker, and as I said, they need to be torqued down to the correct torque spec, and then you will need to tie them down to the correct torque angle. Don't reuse these bolts because you may run into some serious issues, and you really don't want your flywheel to come off just because you saved 20 bucks. So now we're going to install the oil pump. What I need to note is that you need to put it into the freezer, which will make the installation easier, and you also need to oil the O-rings if you got the Muncie Speed oil pump, which is a high volume one. Afterwards you will top the oil pump in, just use our old oil pump cover, and afterwards drive it in with the nuts. Afterwards we will put some assembly lube into the gears and we will install this O-ring. If you got a stock pump, you will need a paper gasket instead. Here you can see that I use a custom-made pump cover, which allows me to use the engine carrier without any modifications and without any interference of the nuts. After this, I'm going to thread on the nuts and the bolts. On the upper part you will use some bolts and the lower part some nuts. The lower nuts are one-time use because they have a seal on them. What you also need to do if you get a high volume oil pump from Muncie Speed is you need to back the studs out approximately 4 turns or so to have enough stud for the nut to grab on. First of all, I make all the nuts hand tight and then I will torque them down with a torque wrench with an X button. So now we are going to prepare our pistons to be installed in our jugs. For this you are going to put your piston ring in like that, and then you will use an old piston or a new piston to push it in. If you get new barrels, it doesn't matter where the ring is, but if you reuse your old barrels, you need to put them down to the very end of the cylinder barrel towards the crankshaft, because it's the part which is the tightest, to be more precise, and it needs to be measured there. So you take your feeler gauges and you check the gap. If it's too big, you need to get new rings. If it's too tight, you need to get a piston ring file or a piston ring grinder, and then create some more clearance. If you don't do this, and if it's too tight, you will end up with a catastrophic engine failure. So I obviously also noted the weight of the pistons. It's the same as the connecting rods, so the first with the third pistons have to be the same weight approximately, and the second with the fourth piston also have to weigh approximately the same. So now I'm going to install the piston rings. So you need to note their location. So my old scraper ring didn't say top on it, but if you have a ring which says top on it, it has to face towards the top, of course. And the oil scraper ring gap has to be facing towards the upper part or upside, and then the second compression ring to the lower part, and then the first compression ring upside again. And you need to use a piston ring installation tool like that. Of course, you can also use your fingers or your hands, but you will damage the piston ring. Even if you don't see it, it has to snap to be damaged. You can overstress the other part of the gap, or the part which is opposed to the gap, by destroying the coating, for example. Colin Schmidt has a great documentation of damages which happen if you don't use this installation tool. So on the first and second compression ring, you have the marking which says top on it, and you also need to be careful that you don't put them in the wrong way, or you're going to run into some serious issues. So now we're going to install the piston into the jug. Everything has been cleaned very well, of course, and for that I'm going to use this special piston installation tool. There are plenty out of there, so you don't need to use this one, but I really like it, to be honest. Also note the orientation of the barrels, of course, or how it's going to sit inside the engine afterwards. So in order to install our pistons now, we'll need to oil everything down, and then you will take this piston installation tool and you will install the piston into it, and afterwards you will install the piston into the cylinder by pressing it in. If you feel any excess resistance, make sure that the piston ring has been installed properly into the piston, and that it's not crooked or something like that, because it may bind if this is the case. So now we are going to install our O-rings. The black one goes towards the bottom. I use silicone lube or engine oil in order to install it, and afterwards I clean my hands to avoid being in contact with any engine oil, because I don't know if the upper O-ring tolerates it, and I use silicone grease for this one. What's also important to note is that sometimes you have to pre-install a piston pin prior to putting it into the engine, but sometimes you have to install a piston ring while the piston is inside the engine. or partially inside. I think you know what I mean. It sticks inside, but it's not connected, of course. It depends on the location where each piston is located. You obviously need to reinstall the securing clips. You're going to get new ones. You don't want to reuse the old ones, and you want them to be facing towards up or down. And you also need to check that they have been seated properly, because sometimes they don't fully seat, and if a circlip comes loose, you will have a catastrophic engine failure, and you don't really want that, because it will cost a lot of money to fix that afterwards. So now we're going to install our piston and jack into the case. In this case, we have to install the piston pin after the piston and jack has been inserted into the case. But we are going to start by installing some assembly loop on the bushing in order to prevent any dry starts and stuff like that. You can use engine oil too. It doesn't really matter if you use assembly loop or engine oil. So for the installation of the piston pin, you can use something like a screwdriver. So in order to help with the alignment of the piston pin and the connecting rod, this is pretty fiddly, to be honest, and it will take around 5 to 10 minutes in order to install it. And obviously you don't want to forget your piston pin securing clip, and also check that it has been seated properly after being installed into the piston. So now we are going to prepare our front main seal. If you have a triple pulley, you will need this O-ring too. If you have a single pulley, you won't need this. So as I said, check that your seal is PTFE, or if it's a classic seal. If it's a PTFE seal, you don't want to oil it down, as I showed on the box. The box is from a different seal, it's not from this one. This is a classic seal. And if it's a classic seal, you want to oil it down like I did in this case. In order to install it, you can use a hammer or this special tool, which makes the job really easy, to be honest. If you have a single pulley, you will tighten it down with a bolt until it bottoms out, and then you will also install the washer and then tighten it down again. If you have the triple pulley, you will just tighten it out without the washer. So if you got a free programmable CPU or injection system from Marco Manzi, you also want to make sure that you create some clearance on the crossover pipe the 1.9 liter system has by removing this small chunk of metal, or you won't be able to install it. If you have a stock engine, you won't need this because you won't have a crankshaft trigger. So afterwards we are going to prepare our hydraulic lifters by bleeding them. You have three methods. You have the factory method, you have the vacuum chamber method, and then you have the oil can method to bleed them. I will show you all of them except the factory one because it has been documented on the manual. So the first one obviously involves the hydraulic lifters being put into a vacuum chamber. The next one will involve this oil can. We will just go with it into the hole of the hydraulic lifter until you feel a very high resistance on the button of it. If you feel very high resistance, probably lead, and to check that, you will just take a oil push rod, a pen or whatever, and try to push it down. If you can't push it down, it has been bled. If you can push it down, it still needs to be bled because there's still some air trap in it. So now we will install some assembly loop into the bores where the lifters sit in. This will eliminate some dry start wear. And then we are going to install our hydraulic lifters into the bores. It's also important to coat the backside of the hydraulic lifters with some assembly lube. So now I'm going to install my water jacket seal. I've cleaned all the sealing surfaces, of course, like you're supposed to. I just don't film it because it would make the video way longer than it needs to be. So now I'm going to install a 1mm bead of silicone sealant. And then I will take some small dabs of silicone grease and put them on there in order to keep the firing in place while installing the heads. You can also do it without it, but you may squish your firing, which wouldn't be that nice because it will create a head gasket leak. Ideally, you obviously don't use anything, but a very small amount won't hurt, to be honest. So now we are going to install our pushrod tubes. You can oil the seals if you want. In my opinion, it makes them seat better. I tried both variants and I personally like it more when they have a small amount of oil on the seals because they get centered easier. So now I'm going to install the new cylinder head. You can also reuse the old one if it passes all the factory manual tests. And I put it in, and I have to be careful, or you have to be careful, for the push rods not to be misaligned or squished in a wrong way. So you need to wiggle the cylinder head a little bit in order for it to be seated. You also need to align the pushrod tubes while trying to put the cylinder head into the correct position. So you wiggled around for it in order to get centered with the cylinder liners. After some pressing and wiggling, it will get seated properly, and then you can move to the next step, which is installing the head nuts with the sealant which is provided with a reseal kit. So you always need to torque these nuts down with the correct pattern. in 2 or 3 stages. The reseal kit says 3 stages, but the manual says 2. Do whatever you like. So after the head has been installed, you will put some assembly lube on the areas the rockers and the push rods will touch in order to eliminate any wear. And you're going to put your push rods in. What's very important is that the push rods have been centered inside the hydraulic lifter and the rocker. If they aren't aligned, you will run into some serious issues. The engine won't run, you may bend some push rods and stuff like that. So make sure to double check that with a flashlight or so. After installing the rocker arm assembly, you obviously want to readjust your valves, which I've covered in our previous video. And here I'm showing you again that the push rods have been aligned properly. And I double checked it with a flashlight because, as I said, it will cause some serious issues if you haven't aligned it properly. So afterwards I torque the rocker arm assembly down with my torque wrench. And now I'm going to install my valve cover with its new gasket. I'm using some stock springs and stock valve covers, and I will also suggest you to use the stock ones because they have a bigger pretension than the aftermarket ones. So now I'm going to install the oil relief piston. I'm oiling it down a little bit and I'm pushing it in. If you see any scratch marks or so, you'd want to replace it. And I also suggest replacing the spring if you can get a new old stock one, because the springs lose their tension over time. They just lose their properties from all these cycles. And I obviously also tighten it down with my torque wrench, and it's very important to first hand tighten it before using any ratchet or so, because you may cross thread these threads because you don't really have a feeling for it due to the spring. So afterwards I will remove the oil pressure switch and I will put my adapter in there, which will pressurize the entire oil system with approximately 3 bars. So after pressurizing the system, you need to remove the spark plugs and crank the engine over with a disconnected fuel delivery, of course, until the oil pressure light comes off. When your light comes off, you can install your spark plugs, and then you can also reactivate the fuel delivery system and try to start the engine up. So when the engine starts up, you will do the following thing in order to break it in properly. You will let it run for 30 seconds or so and idle, and afterwards you will go to 2000 RPM and vary it between 2000 and 3000 RPM for approximately 20 to 30 minutes. Do a few breaks in between, after 10 minutes or 15 minutes, let it cool off a little bit and then do the next cycle. This has to be done in order to break in the flat tappet camshaft and the hydraulic lifters. So afterwards you will run your engine for the kilometers that your braking oil suggests. Then you will do an oil change, you will install your normal oil, and then I would suggest you to replace it again after 1500 kilometers, and then the engine should be broken in and you can have some fun with it. Until then, I would suggest you not to put too much load on it, especially if it's cold, in order to do some damage prevention. So, if you like this video, like, share and subscribe. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the comments below. I hope that everything will be going according to your plan with your engine rebuild, and I wish you a nice day. Bye!